You've reached Frontiers of Antiquity, a podcast exploring the places where civilizations collided, ideas traveled, and history changed forever. Thank you for listening.
So, I want you to imagine a hyper-wealthy ancient empire, like one that engineered this utopian metropolis entirely out of solid rock.
Right.
They commanded the global luxury trade, and they even pulled the strings behind some of the Bible's most famous stories. But you have likely never heard of them in a standard history class. Like, their footprint is basically a mirage.
It really is. It's the absolute definition of a historical blind spot. I mean, we're trained to look for empires that shout their permanence into the void, but we completely miss the ones that mastered the art of invisibility.
Exactly. So, welcome to the deep dive. Usually when we talk about the legacy of an ancient civilization, there's this expectation of a heavy, undeniable footprint. It feels like walking through a museum, right?
Yeah, you look at the Romans and you have like massive aqueducts stretching across Europe, mountains of written records.
Or the Egyptians with the pyramids and the Sphinx. It's comforting to have history be so visible. But when you step into the world of the ancient Middle East, specifically the deserts of Arabia and the Levant, that solid footprint turns into something entirely different.
Completely different, yeah.
So today, our mission is to point our lens at the Nabataeans.
And we have a massive stack of sources to unpack to do this properly. We're looking at historical overviews from ancient geographers, modern archaeological chronologies, linguistic analyses of ancient trade receipts, and cutting-edge architectural studies of their capital city, Petra.
Right.
Because the goal here isn't just to list dates and battles, it's to understand the underlying mechanics of their genius.
We want to go far beyond the pop culture image of Petra as just like an Indiana Jones movie set. We're going to look at how a group of nomadic pastoralists weaponized the harshest environment on Earth. How they engineered an egalitarian society while totally surrounded by god kings. How they birthed the modern Arabic script and, navigated the high-stakes geopolitical drama of the ancient Mediterranean.
Yeah. And to understand how they achieved literally any of that, we have to look at their origins. Because the Nabataeans emerge in the historical record around the 4th century BC in northwestern Arabia.
Right, and they weren't building cities back then, were they?
No, not at all. They began as nomadic pastoralists. They were herders, moving with the seasons, living in tents.
Okay.
But what they were doing was accumulating this flawless generational knowledge of the desert terrain.
Which is wild because that geographical knowledge essentially became their ultimate currency, right? Like they realized they were sitting directly on top of the ancient world's equivalent of the global oil supply chain.
Yes, the incense route.
The incense route. I mean, it's easy to look at frankincense and myrrh through a modern lens and think of them as, I don't know, ancient air fresheners.
Right, like something you'd buy at a boutique.
Exactly. But in the Mediterranean economy, these resins were the equivalent of industrial chemicals and religious currency combined. I mean, the Egyptians required massive, steady shipments for mummification.
And the Greeks and Romans burned literal tons of it as offerings to their gods. They believed the smoke physically carried their prayers to the heavens. State funerals demanded just astronomical quantities.
So the economic reality of that demand is staggering.
Oh, absolutely. Because the trees that produce these resins, the boswellia and commiphora trees, they only grew in very specific, geographically isolated areas in what is today modern Yemen and Oman.
Way down in southern Arabia.
Exactly. So you have this highly constrained remote supply and an infinite desperate demand from the world's most powerful empires. The markup on these goods by the time they reached Rome or Alexandria was unbelievable. They were luxury goods frequently traded for their weight in gold.
And that markup wasn't just like pure profit, right? It was hazard pay because the Nabataeans were the only ones who could reliably transport these goods across the barren, lethal wastelands of the Arabian Peninsula.
Yeah, they monopolized the transport, they charged heavy tolls, provided armed protection, and most importantly, they controlled the water supply along the route.
And this water strategy is where we see their early genius. Like, when most people think of desert survival, they visualize an oasis, a highly visible pool of water surrounded by palm trees.
which is incredibly vulnerable to being captured by an invading army.
Exactly. But the early Nabataeans rejected that model entirely. They engaged in this form of passive psychological warfare against potential invaders. It functions almost like a mental map of invisible safe houses.
That's a great way to put it. What they would do is dig these massive bell-shaped subterranean cisterns deep in the desert floor. They line the interior with a highly specialized waterproof plaster.
To catch the flash floods.
Right. They'd capture rainwater runoff during the brief, violent flash floods that occasionally hit the desert wadis. But the truly brilliant part is what they did next. Once the cistern was full, they would cover the narrow opening with sand, brush, and rocks, so it blended perfectly into the parched desert floor.
That is just so smart.
To a Greek or Roman scout, it looked like miles of deadly dry sand. But the Nabataeans knew exactly where to dig to uncover pristine, cool drinking water.
And even the shape was calculated right, like the bell shape.
Oh yeah. The bell shape is a strict engineering calculation. A narrow opening with a wide bottom drastically reduces the surface area of the water exposed to the air. That minimizes evaporation in the extreme heat.
So it's basically a reverse siege warfare. A traditional empire builds a massive stone wall to keep an invading army out. The Nabataeans just let the desert be the wall.
Exactly.
Like if a heavily armed imperial army, say the Greeks under the Seleucid Empire, tried to pursue them into the deep desert to steal their wealth, the Nabataeans didn't even need to fight them. They simply retreated into the dunes.
They'd uncover their hidden cisterns, hydrate their people and camels, cover the water back up, and just wait.
And the pursuing army would inevitably run out of supply lines, succumb to heat stroke, and die of thirst. They literally let the geography do the killing for them.
By making themselves effectively unconquerable, they protected an absolute monopoly. You cannot conquer an enemy you cannot pursue.
Oh.
And you definitely can't tax a city that is just a temporary tent camp.
Right.
So they transitioned from isolated pastoralists to this highly organized, untouchable syndicate pulling the levers of global commerce.
And the wealth wasn't just flowing from frankincense either. There's another major commodity they monopolize that completely changes how you view their operations, Dead Sea bitumen.
Oh, the asphalt monopoly.
Yeah. It sounds almost anachronistic to talk about an ancient petroleum industry, but that is exactly what they were running.
It's wild to think about. Because of the unique tectonic activity deep beneath the Dead Sea, massive blocks of raw bitumen, which is this black, tar-like petroleum product, would periodically break off from the seabed and float to the surface.
So you have the Nabataeans paddling out onto the saltiest, most buoyant body of water on Earth under a scorching desert sun, physically chopping up floating blocks of petroleum and hauling them ashore.
And they did that grueling labor because the chemical properties of that bitumen were highly prized. I mean, the word money actually derives from the Arabic word mumia, which originally meant bitumen.
Wait, really? The word mummy comes from bitumen?
Yeah, exactly. The Egyptians were desperate for it. The petroleum acted as a powerful sealant and antibacterial agent. It prevented the oxidation and decay of the wrappings, which was crucial for preserving the bodies. So the Nabataeans controlled the Dead Sea, harvested the asphalt, hauled it overland to Egypt, and dictated the market price.
So we have a nomadic society raking in unimaginable wealth from incense, spices, and literal tar, operating behind an impenetrable shield of invisible water.
Yeah.
But you know, a society can only hide its wealth in the sand for so long. At a certain point, that much capital demands permanent infrastructure. They decided to transition from absolute invisibility to extreme permanence. They stopped wandering and built a monumental capital city.
And that capital is Petra, or as they called it, ancient Rakhmu. It's located in a naturally fortified mountainous basin in modern-day southwestern Jordan. And at its peak, this city sustained an estimate of 20,000 to 30,000 people.
Which is crazy, because you might be thinking, how do you cram 30,000 people into an arid desert canyon and keep them hydrated? That requires a monumental leap from hiding rainwater in cisterns to engineering full-scale urban hydraulics.
The water management of Petra is an engineering marvel. It rivals anything built by the Romans. They didn't just survive the desert environment, they subjugated it.
How so?
Well, they engineered this highly sophisticated system of dams, water channels, terracotta pipelines, and massive public reservoirs. They calculated the precise gravitational gradient required to channel fresh water from springs located miles outside the city.
Miles away.
Yes, and they maintained the water pressure so it could feed public fountains, massive swimming pools, and even irrigated botanical gardens right in the city center.
Swimming pools in the desert, that's such a flex. But the sources also mentioned they were heavily reliant on harvesting flash flood waters. And, if you have ever seen footage of a desert flash flood, it's terrifying. It's a violent wall of mud, rocks, and debris roaring down a narrow wadi.
Oh, absolutely.
If you just let that rush into your city, it would obliterate your delicate terracotta pipes and drown everyone. They had to take their greatest natural threat and somehow domesticate it into a public utility. How do they actually manage the physics of that?
The mechanics are fascinating. To protect the city, they built a massive diversion dam at the entrance to the Sick, which is that famous narrow gorge leading into Petra.
Right, the one from the movies.
Exactly. Beside this dam, they chiseled a tunnel directly through the solid rock of the mountain to redirect the violent, high-velocity floodwaters safely around the main civic center.
Wow.
But to actually use that water for drinking, they channeled it into a series of massive settling tanks.
The settling tanks, the fluid dynamics of those are just brilliant.
They really are. Because a flash flood carries a massive load of suspended silt and gravel. If that enters a piping system, it clogs instantly. So they designed these large carved basins. When the fast-moving water enters the wide basin, its velocity drops dramatically.
And without the speed to carry the heavy debris, gravity just takes over, right?
Exactly. The rocks and heavy silt sink to the bottom of the tank. Then, the cleaner water at the top overflows into a second, slightly lower tank, where the process repeats.
So the water slows down even further, finer silt drops out, and the purified water is finally siphoned into the city's main storage reservoirs. I mean, they engineered a self-cleaning, gravity-fed water purification plant in the 1st century BC.
And even the terracotta poets themselves showcase deep technical knowledge. They didn't just lay clay tubes end to end. They designed a sophisticated bell and spigot joint system.
What does that look like?
Basically, one end of a pipe was flared, and the next pipe fit snugly inside it. Then they packed these joints with a hydraulic mortar made of lime and ash to ensure they were entirely watertight. They had to be, to withstand the immense pressure of the gravity-fed water rushing down from the mountains.
That is incredible. And once the water infrastructure secured the survival of the city, they focused on the architecture. This is the image that defines Petra globally, the rock-cut facades.
Yes.
Unlike the Romans or Greeks who quarried stone blocks, transported them, and stacked them from the ground up to build freestanding structures, the Nabataeans just carved their monuments directly into the living, rose-red sandstone cliffs.
Which requires an entirely different philosophy of construction and masonry physics. You have to start at the top of the mountain and carve your way down.
Which is mind-blowing.
Yet you are systematically chiseling away everything that isn't the building. The structural integrity relies entirely on the surrounding bedrock. There is absolutely zero room for error. If a mason miscalculates the strike of a chisel and cracks a massive column, you cannot simply swap in a new block of stone.
Right. The entire facade is just permanently disfigured. It requires a level of three-dimensional foresight that is staggering. And the architectural style itself is also this profound statement. It's a cosmopolitan blend, right?
Highly cosmopolitan. You see indigenous Arabian stepped motifs, Egyptian obelisks, and classical Hellenistic columns and pediments all on the exact same building.
Like a cultural mashup.
Exactly. And the blending of those styles perfectly reflects their geopolitical reality. Because the Nabataeans controlled the intersections of the global trade routes, they were constantly dealing with merchants and diplomats from India, Persia, Egypt, Greece, and Rome. They absorbed the artistic traditions of every major empire and fused them together.
Like with the treasury.
Yeah, the treasury, or al-Khazna, which was likely constructed as a royal mausoleum for King Aridus IV. It features these intricate Corinthian columns right beneath Egyptian-style motifs. It's literally a civilization declaring in stone, "We command the wealth and the culture of the entire known world."
And the sheer scale of these monuments is breathtaking. Adair, the massive structure known as the monastery, sits high up in the mountains and just dwarfs the surrounding landscape.
It's massive.
But the most incredible detail from the sources isn't the size or the style, it's the archaeoastronomy. Modern statisticians and astrophysicists have discovered that these facades function as colossal, mathematically precise solar calendars.
We constantly underestimate the scientific sophistication of ancient societies. The Nabataeans meticulously aligned their most sacred civic and religious monuments with major celestial events.
Give us an example.
Okay, so during the winter solstice, the shortest day of the year, which served as a critical marker for ancient agricultural and religious cycles, the setting sun shines directly through specific, natural gaps in the canyon walls opposite Adair to perfectly eliminate the main altar inside the structure.
That's insane. The statistical probability of that alignment being a geological accident is practically zero.
Absolutely zero. Furthermore, the facade al-Khazna is designed so that specific architectural features cast very deliberate, precise shadows that mark the equinoxes.
So they didn't just impose a rigid grid on the landscape like a Roman city planner. They wove their urban center into the mathematical rhythms of the cosmos and the natural stone. The entire city is a giant functioning astronomical instrument.
It really is.
Yeah.
And this deep attunement to their environment naturally transitions into how they structure their society. Because if we look at the rest of the ancient Mediterranean, Rome, Egypt, the Seleucid Empire, when you find a society possessing this level of staggering wealth, engineering prowess, and monumental architecture, you almost universally find a specific social hierarchy at the top.
Right. You find an absolute autocrat, a brutal tyrant, or a god king.
Precisely. And at the bottom of that pyramid, you find an enormous, violently exploited underclass. I mean, the entire economy of the Roman Empire was built on the backs of millions of enslaved people working the massive agricultural estates or dying in the silver mines.
That was the standard operating procedure for building an ancient superpower. But this is where the Nabataeans present a radical utopian anomaly. The Greek geographer and historian Strabo either visited or had direct, highly detailed accounts of the Nabataean kingdom, and honestly, his descriptions sound entirely fictional when you compare them to the norms of antiquity.
Yeah, Strabo describes a monarchy, but one that operated with a shocking level of egalitarianism. The Nabataean king did not demand groveling or absolute submission. According to the texts, the king was held publicly accountable for his management of the state's resources.
Like an audit.
Basically, he actually had to give a public accounting of his own personal wealth and his expenditures.
The concept of a king facing financial penalties from the general public is wild. A great way to visualize this is to compare it to a modern corporate board of directors. Imagine an ancient kingdom functioning like a massive corporation where the king is the CEO, but he holds equal voting power with the board.
That's a great analogy.
Like if the CEO makes a disastrous strategic error that costs the kingdom money, the shareholders, his subjects, can literally dock his pay or issue a financial penalty against him. Try suggesting that structural accountability to a pharaoh or a Caesar. You'd lose your head.
You really would. It fundamentally contradicts the concept of divine right that defined every other major power. And this egalitarian ethos was deeply embedded in their daily social cohesion, particularly in their communal banquets, known as symposia.
Oh, the 13-person banquets?
Yes. The sources note these banquets were strictly limited to 13-person groups to ensure intimacy and equal participation. And Strabo explicitly notes that at these banquets, the king frequently served his own guests, pouring the wine and serving the food himself.
Placing the monarch on an equal footing with the subjects is a profound cultural statement. If we analyze the mechanics of why they evolved this way, it traces directly back to their nomadic origins, right?
Absolutely.
Because when your society is born in the deep desert, an environment that is actively trying to kill you every single day, arbitrary class stratification is a luxury you cannot afford. Survival requires extreme horizontal cooperation.
Exactly. Every member of a nomadic tribe has a vital role in keeping the community alive. If a leader makes a bad decision about where to find water, it doesn't just mean a dip in the economy. It means the entire tribe dies of thirst.
Right.
Therefore, leadership is naturally held accountable, and the community relies on mutual respect rather than coercion. The remarkable achievement of the Nabataeans is that they managed to retain this democratic, survivalist ethos even after they became a fabulously wealthy, urbanized empire.
Which directly explains one of the most shocking economic details in the sources. Nabataean society had virtually zero institutional slavery.
It is a massive anomaly for a major commercial power of that era. I mean, they managed a sprawling multinational logistics network, complex urban centers, and massive agricultural projects without relying on human bondage.
Or how did they get it done?
Instead, they utilized highly organized cooperative labor, familial tribal networks, and hired freelance workers. It really speaks to the incredible efficiency of their social contracts.
And that progressive horizontal structure also completely redefined the legal status of women. Because in ancient Greece or Judea, women were generally subservient to a male guardian, a father, a husband, or a brother. They rarely held autonomous wealth or legal standing.
True.
But the archaeological findings from Nabataea, specifically legal papyri preserved in the desert caves, and their numismatic evidence tell a completely different story.
Well, the legal papyri clearly demonstrate that Nabataean women possess the independent right to inherit, own, and sell real estate. We have explicit records of women purchasing highly expensive elite tomb plots and initiating complex legal contracts.
On their own.
On their own. They handled major financial transactions autonomously without requiring a male guardian's signature to validate the deal.
That's amazing. We even see queens like Sheklat and Holdu minted on the official silver currency alongside the kings. And the numismatic experts point out that these weren't just decorative portraits of consorts. Their prominence on the coinage often signified genuine, active ruling power.
Yes. If a king died and the heir was too young, the queen assumed the regency and ruled the empire. And the society accepted female authority without the systemic resistance you would see in, say, Rome.
Now, this flexibility in their social identity extended directly to their language, too, which introduces this fascinating linguistic phenomenon known as diglossia. Diglossia occurs when a society uses two distinct languages, or distinct varieties of a single language, for completely different social functions.
Right. And the Nabataeans were native Arabic speakers. In their daily lives, in the markets of Petra, or at home with their families, they spoke an early unwritten dialect of Old Arabic.
But because they were the ultimate international merchants, constantly negotiating treaties and trade deals with empires from Egypt to Persia, an unwritten local dialect was useless for official state business.
Completely useless. Therefore, for their written medium diplomatic correspondence, legal contracts, and the monumental inscriptions carved into their tombs, they adopted Imperial Aramaic. Aramaic functioned as the lingua franca of the ancient Middle East.
Much like English functions in global business today.
Exactly. But the mechanics of how they used Aramaic is where the historical magic happens. Because their internal cognitive process was running in Arabic, when they sat down to write a contract in Aramaic, their native language inevitably bled into the text.
Ah, I see.
Yeah, you start seeing unique Arabic loanwords, Arabic syntactical structures, and Arabic personal names filling these formal Aramaic documents.
It's a profound process of linguistic fusion.
Yeah.
And it wasn't just the vocabulary that changed, right? It was the physical mechanics of the script itself.
Yes, because standard Aramaic was written in rigid, separated block-style letters, which was fine for carving into stone. But the Nabataean scribes were running a fast-paced global trade network. They were constantly writing receipts, tax documents, and letters on papyrus and leather.
And writing block letters on papyrus is slow and inefficient.
Exactly. So to speed up the process, they developed a flowing cursive script. The characters began to loop and connect to one another, allowing the scribe to write continuous words without lifting the pen from the papyrus.
And the historical weight of that cursive transition cannot be overstated. Centuries later, long after the political collapse of the Nabataean kingdom, this specific, connected cursive script survived among the nomadic desert tribes. By the 5th and 6th centuries AD, it had directly mutated into the pre-Islamic Arabic script.
Yes. The ancient administrative and trade script developed by Nabataean accountants is the direct ancestor of the classical script used to write the Quran.
They essentially birthed the alphabet of a major world religion.
It's an incredible legacy.
It really is. And this blending of Arabic and Aramaic in their daily lives perfectly mirrors how they conceptualize the divine. Just as they refused to be boxed into one rigid linguistic identity, they completely rejected the rigid human-shaped gods of the Greeks and Romans. The sources detail a religious practice centered on aniconism.
Right. When you observe the religious art of Greece or Rome, the divine is heavily anthropomorphized. Zeus is depicted as a muscular man with a beard. Aphrodite is a beautiful woman. But the Nabataeans fundamentally rejected the idea of limiting the divine to a human form. They practiced strict aniconism, which is the deliberate avoidance of creating human or animal images to represent their gods.
Instead, they worshipped deities like Dushara, known as the Lord of the Mountain, and Al-Yuza, the goddess of power, in the form of betyls. A betyl is basically a stark, monumental, rectangular block of stone or an obelisk. They chiseled these massive, abstract, geometric cubes directly into the cliff faces of Petra.
And the betyl served as the dwelling place of the god, or the abstract representation of the divine presence itself. It's a profound theological statement.
How so?
Well, it implies a belief that the divine force is too vast, too fundamental to the natural world, and too incomprehensible to be contained within the familiar shape of a mere human being. Even in later centuries, when Hellenistic influence crept in and they began to subtly carve faint eyes or noses onto some of these blocks, the core representation remained a stark, minimalist monolith.
So we have a picture of a truly unique civilization here. They're fabulously wealthy from a global trade monopoly, physically protected by the harsh desert geography, socially egalitarian with high female autonomy and no institutional slavery, and religiously attuned to abstract cosmology.
It sounds perfect, but geopolitics abhors a vacuum.
Right. A society this wealthy, strategically positioned on the map, and culturally distinct was inevitably going to violently collide with the aggressively expanding powers around them, specifically the Kingdom of Judea and the Roman Empire.
Yeah, wealth attracts attention and geography dictates destiny. The Nabataeans could not stay isolated in Petra forever because their incense route had to reach the Mediterranean Sea. And the final critical leg of that logistics network required cutting directly across the Negev desert, which constitutes the southern half of modern-day Israel.
And this expansion into the Negev shifts the story from engineering and sociology into a full-blown geopolitical thriller. Initially, the Nabataeans only maintained temporary encampments along this final route to rest their camel caravans. But as the sheer volume of wealth pouring through the route increased, those rest stops evolved into highly sophisticated, permanent urban centers.
Cities like Avda, Mamshit, Shifta, and Alusa, which are now actually a UNESCO World Heritage Route.
Wow.
The development of those Negev cities highlights their incredible adaptability. Mamshit, for example, evolved beyond a mere trade hub into a center for breeding elite Arabian horses, which is a highly lucrative military commodity.
And Shifta became an agricultural marvel, right?
Yes, the Nabataeans applied their hydraulic genius to dryland farming there, utilizing complex microcatchments to grow massive grape and olive harvests in a region that receives less than 4 inches of rain annually.
But building permanent, wealthy cities right on the southern border of the Jewish state meant friction was inevitable. Now, during the mid-2nd century BC, the relationship was actually quite cooperative. This was the era of the Maccabean Revolt. The Jewish Hasmonean dynasty and the Nabataeans were both local powers trying to fight off the heavy hand of the Greek Seleucid Empire.
Right. The ancient book of 1 Maccabees describes the Jewish rebel leaders, Judas Maccabeus and his brother Jonathan, meeting the Nabataeans in the desert and operating as tactical allies.
However, tactical alliances between rising powers rarely last once the mutual threat is removed.
Very true.
By the early 1st century BC, under King Alexander Jannaeus, the Hasmonean kingdom had secured its independence and transformed into an aggressive, expansionist regional power. Jannaeus looked south to the Mediterranean coast and realized that if he could capture the port city of Gaza, he could effectively strangle the Nabataean trade network and siphon the wealth into Judea.
So he besieged Gaza and began annexing Nabataean territories east of the Jordan River.
Which the Nabataeans obviously viewed as an existential threat. Cutting off the port meant killing the empire. So this geopolitical tension exploded at the Battle of Gadara in 93 BC. And the military tactics used by the Nabataeans here are just extraordinary.
Yeah, the Nabataean king, Obotus I, launched a massive, carefully orchestrated ambush against Jannaeus' advancing forces in a steep, rocky valley in the modern-day Golan region. He utilized a weapon system that the Judean infantry and traditional horse cavalry were entirely unprepared to counter.
Massive, highly organized camel cavalry charges.
Yes.
You have to picture the biomechanical terror of this tactic. Camels are massive, towering animals that can traverse broken, rocky terrain much faster and more securely than horses. More importantly, horses are instinctively terrified of the unique smell and imposing sight of charging camels.
Exactly. Obotus used these camel units to drive the panicked Judean army into a deep, inescapable ravine. It was an absolute slaughter. They nearly killed the Hasmonean king himself, shattered the Judean military threat, and firmly reestablished their absolute supremacy over the trade routes.
So the Hasmonean threat was neutralized, but the geopolitical landscape was constantly shifting. A few decades later, the relationship between Judea and Nabatea morphed from simple border disputes into an incredibly complex web of bloodlines and dynastic feuds.
Oh yeah, and this centers around perhaps the most famous king in Judean history, Herod the Great.
Herod the Great, the king who built the massive Second Temple in Jerusalem, the figure looming over the biblical Christmas narrative. A lot of people do not realize that the king of the Jews was actually half Nabataean.
It's a huge detail. His ethnic background heavily influenced regional politics. His father, Antipater, was an Idumean nobleman who forged deep strategic and diplomatic alliances with the Nabataean court at Petra. To cement this alliance, Antipater married an elite Nabataean royal princess named Cypros.
So Herod the Great was of Nabataean royal descent on his mother's side.
Yes. In fact, during his early career, when a violent civil war erupted in Judea, Herod fled into the deep desert and sought refuge with his mother's family in Petra.
You might assume that having a half-Nabataean king sitting on the throne in Jerusalem would guarantee an era of peace and lucrative cooperation between the two nations.
You'd think so.
But geopolitics and absolute power rarely accommodate family sentiment.
Right. Once the Roman Empire officially installed Herod as the king of Judea in 37 BC, his strategic calculus changed entirely. He no longer viewed the Nabataeans as his protective kin. He viewed them as his primary geopolitical rivals for dominance in the Levant. He needed to prove to his Roman overlords that he was the undisputed strongman of the region.
And this rivalry was heavily exacerbated by Cleopatra over in Egypt.
Oh, she was brilliant, ruthless, and highly manipulative. She coveted the immense wealth of both Judea and Nabatea. She actively manipulated Roman political factions to pit Herod and the Nabataean king Malichus Astarte against each other.
Her strategy was basically to let them exhaust their military resources in a proxy war, so she could eventually sweep in and absorb both of their territories into the Ptolemaic kingdom, right?
Exactly. And her manipulations culminated in a brutal border war around 31 BC. The conflict was actually catalyzed by a devastating earthquake that leveled parts of Judea. The Nabataeans sensed weakness and launched an invasion.
And Herod was ready.
Yeah, Herod the Great was a brilliant, albeit ruthless, military tactician. He launched a fierce counteroffensive across the Jordan River, decisively crushed the Nabataean army, and temporarily forced the kingdom into a subordinate vassal status under strict Roman oversight.
Wow. The family reunions must have been incredibly tense.
Definitely.
But the dynasty drama doesn't end with Herod the Great. It spills over into the next generation and creates a direct, violent collision with one of the most famous stories in the New Testament. The geopolitical reality operating beneath the biblical text here is fascinating.
You're referring to the reign of Herod Antipas and the infamous divorce scandal involving John the Baptist.
Exactly. So, after Herod the Great dies, his son, Herod Antipas, who is the ruler of Galilee, frequently mentioned in the Gospels, needs to secure his southern borders. He executes a classic act of high-stakes diplomacy by marrying the daughter of the Nabataean king, Aridus V, thereby maintaining a vital peace treaty between Judea and Petra.
And it is worth noting that Aridus V was arguably the most powerful monarch in Nabataean history. His long reign is widely considered the golden age of Petra, a period of massive architectural expansion and economic peak. Marrying his daughter was a major geopolitical commitment.
But then, Herod Antipas takes a trip to Rome, visits his half-brother, and falls passionately in love with his half-brother's wife, a woman named Herodias. Antipas decides he wants to marry Herodias, but to do so, he has to divorce his current wife, the Nabataean princess.
He is preparing to publicly cast aside the daughter of Aridus V.
Which is a huge mistake. The princess gets tipped off to this humiliating plot. She secretly flees the palace in Galilee, makes a desperate run across the border, and escapes back to her father's fortress in Petra. Now, enter John the Baptist. In the biblical narrative, John the Baptist begins publicly and aggressively condemning Herod Antipas in the streets, declaring that it is unlawful for him to have his brother's wife.
Now, the biblical text frames this entirely as a moral and theological objection to the violation of marital law.
But when you apply the geopolitical context to the situation, you realize the massive danger of what John the Baptist is doing. By publicly attacking this new marriage and drawing intense public attention to the divorce, John isn't just preaching morality. He is throwing a spotlight on a massive, humiliating insult to the Nabataean royal family.
Yeah, he is actively destabilizing the vital regional peace treaty.
He's essentially screaming to the public, "Our ruler just deeply insulted the most powerful desert warlord in the region."
The political fallout for Antipas was catastrophic. He realizes that John the Baptist is inflaming public sentiment in a way that could easily provoke a Nabataean invasion. So Antipas arrests John and, as the famous story goes, ultimately executes him to suppress the political unrest and appease Herodias.
But executing the prophet did not save Antipas from the geopolitical consequences. Because King Aridus IV is sitting in Petra and he is enraged. His royal daughter has been publicly humiliated and sent packing.
So in 36 AD, Aridus IV launches a massive, devastating retaliatory military invasion into Herod Antipas' territory. The Nabataean forces utterly annihilate the Judean army. It was such a total military collapse that the Roman Empire actually had to intervene. They were preparing to send legions down from Syria just to prevent Aridus from annexing the entire region.
It provides incredible depth to the historical record. The famous story of John the Baptist losing his head wasn't just a localized religious dispute. It was the direct spark that ignited a massive international border war between Judea and Petra. The Bible documents the moral narrative, but beneath it is a complex, volatile web of Nabataean diplomacy and military power.
Absolutely. And the Nabataeans intersect with the biblical narrative again a few years later, this time involving the Apostle Paul.
Yes, the texts provide explicit evidence of the kingdom's massive reach. After Paul experiences his famous conversion on the road to Damascus, he begins preaching in the city, which angers local factions who attempt to arrest him. In his second letter to the Corinthians, Paul recounts that he had to be lowered down the city wall in a basket through a window to escape.
And crucially, Paul explicitly names the authority he was escaping from. In Damascus, the governor under Aridus the king was guarding the city to seize me.
He is referring to the exact same King Aridus IV ruling from Petra.
Precisely. This passing reference is a vital piece of historical evidence for modern scholars. It proves that the geopolitical reach of the Nabataean kingdom in the 1st century AD extended incredibly far north. King Aridus IV maintained an ethnarch, a governor, or an authorized military police presence deep into modern-day Syria, actively policing major cosmopolitan cities like Damascus. They were a sprawling regional superpower projecting force far beyond the desert.
Paul drops another fascinating geographical clue in his letter to the Galatians. He writes that immediately after his conversion, he did not go to Jerusalem. Instead, he says, I went away into Arabia, where he spent 3 formative years.
And this requires a correction of modern geographical assumptions. When a 1st century Roman citizen like Paul used the term Arabia, he was not referring to the deep, empty interior of the modern Saudi Arabian Peninsula.
Right.
In the political cartography of antiquity, Arabia was the specific formal designation for the kingdom of Nabataea. The Romans later officially annexed the territory under the name Arabia Petraea.
Oh, wow.
Therefore, Paul spent 3 critical years living, studying, and likely preaching within the Nabataean kingdom, quite possibly in the capital of Petra itself or one of its major northern provincial cities.
Their deep entwinement with foundational historical texts extends all the way back to the Old Testament, too. The sources point out the connection with the stronghold of Selah.
Yes. In the books of 2 Kings and Isaiah, there are references to an ancient, seemingly impregnable Edomite mountain fortress called Selah. The word Selah literally translates to the rock in Hebrew.
Which makes sense.
Because the Greek translation of the rock is Petra, historical geographers strongly associate the biblical Selah with the dramatic, fortified canyon basin that the Nabataeans later inherited from the Edomites and transformed into their magnificent capital. The location has served as a strategic anchor for millennia.
We've traced the trajectory of an empire that mastered hydraulic engineering, reshaped regional geopolitics, birthed the ancestor of the Arabic alphabet, and intercepted with the foundational events of Christianity. Because their cultural and linguistic shadow over the Arabian Peninsula is so incredibly vast, it has recently sparked one of the most intense, controversial historical debates of the modern era.
It's a fascinating controversy that really demonstrates the profound, lingering mystery of the Nabataeans. We're talking about the intensely debated origins of Islam, specifically a revisionist model known as the Petra-Mecca theory.
Because the Nabataeans birthed the script that would eventually be used to write the Quran, a researcher named Dan Gibson proposed a theory that takes this connection to an extreme conclusion. His theory argues that the original holy city of Islam, the true birthplace of religion, was not Mecca, as is universally accepted, but was actually the Nabataean capital of Petra.
And it is crucial that we impartially unpack exactly what the mechanics of his argument are and precisely how the mainstream academic community responds to it, because the claims are highly contentious.
Definitely. So let's break down the mechanics of Gibson's argument first. What are the specific pillars supporting this theory?
Gibson's revisionist theory rests primarily on 2 pillars: architectural archaeoastronomy and the geographic descriptions found in early texts. The most prominent piece of his argument involves the physical alignment of the Qibla.
The direction of prayer.
Right. The Qibla is the sacred direction that Muslims face during prayer, which is traditionally oriented toward the Kaaba in Mecca. Gibson analyzed the structural foundations of a number of the earliest Islamic mosques built during the Umayyad period, which is the 1st century of the Islamic Empire.
And what did he find?
He claims that his measurements indicate that the prayer niches, the Qiblas, in these specific early mosques do not point mathematically toward Mecca. Instead, he argues, their physical alignment points directly toward Petra in southern Jordan.
He is using physical measurements of ancient ruins to argue the focal point of the religion was hundreds of miles north. That's a bold claim. What is the second pillar involving the texts?
The second pillar relies on his interpretation of the textual descriptions of the foundational holy city found in early Islamic literature and the Hadith. Gibson argues that the geographic descriptions of the city, which include specific mentions of a valley, a stream, olive trees, loam, and towering, steep rock-cut fortresses, do not logically match the arid, flat, relatively featureless topography of Mecca.
Okay, I can see that.
However, he argues, those precise descriptions perfectly match the topography of Petra, with its deep sick, its complex water channels, and its imposing rock-cut facades. Therefore, he concludes that the foundation of the religion occurred in Petra, and the geographical focal point was only later moved to Mecca for political reasons during the early Islamic civil wars.
Theories like this often sound incredibly compelling when presented in isolation, almost like a historical detective story. But we need to clearly distinguish between a provocative internet theory and the actual rigorous consensus of the archaeological community. How do mainstream historians and archaeologists analyze and respond to these specific claims?
The mainstream academic consensus among global historians, archaeologists, and Islamic scholars is a complete categorical rejection of Gibson's theory. The academic refutation systematically dismantles both pillars of his argument.
Okay, let's look at the debunking of the mosque alignments first. How do scholars explain the Qiblas pointing in slightly different directions if they aren't pointing to a secret holy city?
The academic community points out that Gibson's methodology expects pinpoint, GPS-level mathematical accuracy from 7th century builders spread across thousands of miles of desert, which is historically and technologically unreasonable.
Right, they didn't have smartphones.
Exactly. Early mosques were oriented using ancient, often rudimentary mathematical and navigational methods. Builders in the 7th century did not possess modern cartographic projections. They relied on folk astronomy, solar alignments, the rising and setting of specific seasonal star groups, and general cardinal directions relative to their local geography.
So there was bound to be some drift.
Variations in the Qibla alignments among early mosques are widely documented by historians and are easily attributed to the technological and navigational limitations of the era, not to a clandestine alternate holy city. As mathematical navigation and astrolabe technology improved over subsequent centuries, the alignments naturally became more standardized and precise toward Mecca.
That makes perfect logical sense. If you are building a mosque in Syria in the 7th century and your navigation relies on the position of a star, a minor mathematical miscalculation over hundreds of miles of curvature is going to result in a physical alignment that looks like it's pointing somewhere else entirely to a modern satellite map. What about the archaeological evidence within Petra itself?
The physical archaeology of Petra is the definitive nail in the coffin for the theory, according to mainstream scholars. There is absolutely zero archaeological evidence of 7th century Islamic religious practice occurring in Petra.
Zero.
Zero. By the time of the Prophet Muhammad in the early 7th century, Petra had been largely abandoned as a major urban center for hundreds of years. The global trade routes had shifted away from the overland desert caravans to the maritime routes of the Red Sea, basically destroying their economy.
Oh, wow.
Furthermore, a series of massive, devastating earthquakes in the 4th and 6th centuries physically shattered the city's complex aqueducts and monumental structures. Petra was in ruins. It was not a thriving, populated metropolis capable of serving as the epicenter of a massive, organized new religious movement.
So there was nobody there to even start a movement.
Exactly. The academic consensus remains entirely firm. The origins of Islam are deeply rooted in the Hijaz region of Western Arabia, centered on Mecca and Medina, and have absolutely no connection to the ruined Nabataean capital in Jordan.
While the theory itself evaporates under the rigorous tools of modern historical methodology, the fact that people are even having this debate centuries later speaks volumes. It highlights how massive the Nabataean legacy is. Their influence on the Arabic language, their mastery of the desert trade routes, and their cultural footprint were so profound that even when looking at their empty ruins, modern people still wonder if they secretly birthed the modern world.
They cast an incredibly long, complex shadow over human history.
Let's pull the threads of this deep dive together. We started with the image of the Nabataeans as master illusionists, a nomadic pastoralist people who understood the desert topography so intimately that they figured out how to hide oceans of water beneath the sand, essentially weaponizing the geography to outsmart Greek and Roman empires that were armed to the teeth.
They utilized that psychological warfare to secure an absolute monopoly on the world's most precious luxury goods, incense from Yemen and bitumen from the Dead Sea. And they took that staggering wealth and decided to display it.
They built a utopian metropolis out of living rock in a desert canyon. They engineered sophisticated fluid dynamics with settling tanks to domesticate violent flash floods, and they carved colossal solar calendars into the mountains to track the cosmos.
Beyond their engineering, they constructed a society that actively defied the brutal norms of antiquity. They operated a wealthy economy with minimal to no institutional slavery. They granted women autonomous economic and legal power. They structured an egalitarian monarchy where the king served his own subjects at dinner and faced financial accountability.
They operated a diglossic society, blending Arabic and Aramaic, which ultimately forced the evolution of the cursive Arabic alphabet used by over 1 billion people today. They orchestrated massive cavalry charges, manipulated the geopolitics of Rome and Judea, and inadvertently provided the volatile background drama for major biblical events, from the execution of John the Baptist to the escape of the Apostle Paul.
By any historical metric, they were an economic, architectural, and cultural superpower of the ancient world.
And yet, they are largely absent from the standard historical narrative. When we opened this discussion, we talked about footprints versus mirages. The Romans left a heavy footprint. You cannot ignore their aqueducts and their colosseums, but the Nabataeans, their physical empire was eventually swallowed back up by the desert. The global trade routes shifted to the sea, massive earthquakes shattered their incredible hydraulic infrastructure, and the desert sands literally blew over their invisible cisterns once again.
Yeah.
They left behind a deeply influential written script. They left behind spectacular, empty rock-cut tombs in a canyon, and then they quietly faded into a mystery.
It remains one of the most profound historical vanishing acts we have on record.
It leaves me with a thought that I cannot shake, and I want you to mull this over. We look at the Nabataeans, a civilization that was hyper-successful, incredibly wealthy, socially advanced, and possessing engineering that rivaled Rome, and we see how easily they faded from the main stage of history, becoming misunderstood and often forgotten by the general public.
Right.
If an empire that permanent seeming, an empire that literally carved its power into the living mountains can become a historical ghost, what aspects of our modern empires are destined to fade? We look at our digital networks, our massive steel cities, and our globalized supply chains, and we assume they are permanent. But thousands of years from now, when the dust settles, what bizarre theories will future archaeologists invent when they are digging through the fractured ruins of our world? Will they be able to clearly read the footprint we left behind? Or will we just be another mirage in the desert?
A deeply sobering question.
Something to think about. Until next time.